Last time we learned the basics of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and we built this demo page in our quiz application. And now we're going to get to actually building that quiz page in our application. And so the goal is to be able to use this service called OpenTriviaDB, which provides a trivia API for us. And an API just stands for Application Programming Interface. You can think of it as generically a term that we use to talk about when two pieces of software interact with one another. So for instance, when we're in JavaScript land and we say something like document.querySelector, we're actually interfacing with the browser software and asking it to find something in our element tree. And so here, when we're talking about an API, it is a service. So there is a server that is listening for us to make requests to it, and then it gives back to us trivia questions. So I can customize this. I can sort of choose how many questions, a category, difficulty, and whether I want multiple choice or true false. Hit generate URL. It gives me this URL that I can pop open in my browser, and we can see that it gives us back, like here I chose easy film questions. It tells us the category, a question, the correct answer, and then 3 incorrect answers. So we're going to use this structure as the basis for the quiz application. So hopefully we'll be able to get to hooking this up to our quiz application. So we're going to use this structure of four possible answers, with one of them being correct for all the questions in our application. Before we jump into coding, we should actually do a step called wireframing. And wireframing, if you haven't heard of it before, is a really simple planning technique that involves really just like making squiggles and boxes on the page, especially if we're going to do this by hand, to block out where things go in our application. So it's not about high fidelity, as you can see here. It is just about like, let's figure out the organization of where things go on the page. And as we do that, we'll start to get a better idea of the like types of HTML elements that we're going to need to be able to build our page. And our whole process will be a lot more efficient if we have this kind of roadmap before we get started. And so there are a lot of different pieces of software that will help you with wireframing, and there are ones that allow you to sort of sequence screens together and make them interactive. We're just going to use pencil and paper, so I'm going to pop open a whiteboard now for us to work in. So the idea here, again, it's not about fidelity, it is just about blocking out the content. So we've already got some of our application designed. Give us a little browser window here. Like at the top, we have these 3 emoji for our logo, and then below that we have kind of a nav bar. And I'm going to put 3 here and pretend that we'll have the play, the about page, and maybe a settings page in our application. Then below that, maybe we're going to have a readout for the score, and maybe like the difficulty or the level, and then the question number, and that'll be like 1 of 10, and then we'll have a question. So I'm going to grab one from the Open Trivia database so that we can play with some actual content in our design here. So who is the main protagonist? In the 1985 film Back to the Future. And then below that, we're going to need 4 buttons. And Marty McFly is one of the answers. Emmett Doc Brown. Biff Tannen. George McFly. And that's basically it for wireframing. So once we have this, we can start to play with some of the design. Like maybe I'm already thinking about how for this readout up here, I might want to draw it in like a box or a circle and have that be a filled in color and the text be inverted. So the text be in white. That might be something we do when we get to the actual design. But also at this stage, what we can start to do is plan out the different elements. So we know that this up at the top here is going to be our header. And then, you know, for this next section, this might be a list because we have 3 items that are sort of coherently together, the stats of our game. This might be a header or a paragraph. Whoops, sorry, I mean like an H1 or a P. And then these buttons, again, are probably going to be a list that's filled with list items that have buttons in them. We'll probably come back to this wireframing as we move into React and start building more pages to our application. But just as a preview, what we can do with wireframing is we could come up with the flow for our whole application. Like maybe there is a main welcome page that has the title of the application and then kind of has like a player input box where they put their name in and maybe they choose how many questions or their sort of like category, and then there's a giant play button at the bottom that then takes them to this game application. And then after they go through a series of rounds, they end up at a kind of final screen that has their stats. Like it has their name and their score and whatever else we want to put on there. Okay, so let's flip over to our code and start building this. So we have our about page. If we go to our quiz page, we just have this placeholder HTML. So what we're going to want to do is start building out this skeleton of what we built in the wireframe stage. So we're going to bring over our header and footer. We'll start building out the stats, and we'll start building out this trivia with these buttons. So I'm going to flip back here. I'm going to go to my index.html, and I'm going to use the Emmet expansion of typing in an exclamation point and hitting tab. Let's zoom in a little bit here. This will be our quiz game play. And I'm going to grab the header and footer, bring those over. Get rid of these comments because we were just putting those in for learning purposes when we were writing the header and footer for the first time. Grab the footer and give ourselves a main. Save this, check it out. All right, so we have the basic content. It is unstyled. We will get to styling after we build out all of the content on the page. So let's grab this question that we used in the wireframing, and I'm going to paste this in so that we have something to refer to without having to keep going back to the browser. And we'll build out that trivia block, this section here first. So we're going to put the text of the question, a list of buttons below it. So I'm going to create a div here. Div is just a generic container element for content. It is block level by default, and unlike paragraph or H1, it doesn't have a specific semantic meaning. So we're going to create a div. This is our container for all of the trivia stuff. Then let's create a paragraph for our question. And then below that, we will want a unordered list with 4 list items. And I'm going to fill them in with the content here. So we've got Marty, we have Emmett Doc Brown, we have Biff Tannen, and George McFly. And you'll notice that there's this thing called an HTML entity here. So some characters in HTML are reserved, and the way you represent them is through using this escape sequence where you type a ampersand, it ends with a semicolon, and you type in the short name of the character you're trying to type in. So here, this is a quotation mark, a double quote. So if we check out our page, we'll see Emmett double quote Doc Brown. These are HTML entities. So if you sort of check out W3, there are entities for representing different characters. For instance, we can change the character that's in our title up here from a dash to an M dash, which is a different size dash. So there we go, quiz game play, and maybe I'll change that in the about as well. There we go. Okay, so the content that we're going to get from this API is going to have these escaped characters, these HTML entities in it, which will actually make it really easy for us to inject this from JavaScript land into the browser later. So each of these list items we want to wrap in a button. So that if we check this out in the browser, each of these will be clickable as a response to that question. There's also an option here where we can wrap with abbreviation from Emmett and type in the word button, and it'll wrap that text for us. So we got 4 buttons. Now let's start to build out that stats section here with the score level and question. So this is also going to be in our main because it's the main content of this page. So I'm going to give us a div, which will be our, oh, actually no, this, we wanted to make it a list. So this is a UL, and then we have a list item for our score. That's going to be something like this. But since we had decided that it'll be sort of score and then the number below it, level, the number below it, we actually want this to be a block level element and this to be a block level element. And that'll also make it really easy if we separate out these as different elements. From JavaScript, we'll be able to target this one and just replace it, and target this one and just replace it without having to futz around with making sure that the label stays the same. So let's give ourselves a block level generic wrapper for score, and then below that we will put the number, and that'll just be a placeholder of 0 for now. So score 0, and I'm going to copy this. This is going to be our level. This is going to be our question, like 1 of 10. Check it out. So score and the number are showing up on different lines because they're block level elements. Same for question and level. And when we get into our styling, we'll be able to push these so that these actually show up in 3 columns. And same here, when we get to styling, we'll be able to make sure that these show up in a grid that is 2 by 2. So let's start working on the CSS. We can get rid of this comment here. and we've got our CSS here, main.css, so we can actually link this in here. So link to CSS, main.css, and save it, and we'll get some of the styling from our other page, like our background coming in. And actually, let's do some cleanup here. So we saw that we could import other CSS files, like this CSS file from Google Fonts we're able to import. We can split our styling into multiple files and use the import syntax to bring them in. So for instance, we have some general page styling here. We have some of our header styling. We have some of our about page specific styling here. So I'm going to break this out. Let's create a new about.css. And into that, let's grab this click speak button. Save this, go back here, paste it in. So as soon as I move it into about.css, that means we've removed it from the rules. So if I go to the about page and check it out, those buttons have gone back to their default styling. So what I need to do in our main.css is come up to the top and import it. So import about.css. And our buttons go back to their normal styling. Let's create a CSS file for our header. And let's grab this and the logo and main nav. Put that into our header. Import our header. Let's create one for our footer. And go back and make sure that we import that footer. And the rest of this is general page styling. So maybe I'll create one more that is general.css. Grab all of this and paste it in here. And go back to main and bring in general.css. So the styling should be about the same. Nothing should have changed. We have subtly changed the order in which the rules are being applied. And remember, we saw that if you target, say, the body multiple times, and we tried to apply like this color to the body multiple times, the last rule wins. So actually the order in which we bring these in is kind of important. And I'm going to sort of, as a general rule, start with the most generic styling and then include the more specific styling below it. So we've kind of got general, header, footer, about, and then we'll have two more. Let's have stats.css and trivia item.css. And I'm going to import those and import stats and trivia item. So this is a bit cleaner. This is easier to read because we're modularizing our CSS. We're splitting it up based on where that CSS is being applied, which will make this CSS more portable, and this will start to make more sense when we move into React and split up our CSS even more. So let's focus on the stats first. So if we go back to our index.html, here are our stats, and we're going to need to install some class names so that we can actually refer to these things and apply some styling to them. So we're going to see some of the power of classes, which allow us to define styles that get applied to multiple things. So each of these elements, we're basically going to style the same way. They are essentially a label and then a value. So let's create some classes here. This UL. Let's call this the stats, this list item. Let's call this stats stat container. And I'm going to apply this same class to these two list items. And let's create class equals stats stat label. And we'll do the same thing here. I'm just using control and clicking multiple times to get multiple cursors. Stats stat, whoops, 2 underscores here. Stat value. Oops, and I forgot 2 underscores here. It's worth taking a beat and talking about this naming convention that I'm using here called BEM, which stands for Block Element Modifier. And it's a way to consistently label your CSS classes in a modular way. The idea here that we're trying to work around is that, you know, if we have a large, this is a small application, but if we have a large application, there are 50 developers, the names that we choose for our class names may conflict with the names that someone else chooses on another page. So I could have called this class label instead of stats __ stat label. And it might be that the a developer on another page, so let's just pretend this is on another page, creates another div somewhere else that is called a class label, and that developer made their own styles that were specific to that page for this class. So we're going to end up then having this conflict where we have two classes called label, which are really trying to style different things, and we'll end up having sort of those two styling sets of rules conflicting with one another. So the idea with BEM is, well, let's come up with a way that we can name our CSS in a logical way that ensures that we don't end up in these states where we're running into conflicts. So let me pull up a tab for BEM. Let's see, let's go to the introduction. So BEM is an acronym for Block Element Modifier, and the idea is that you start off thinking, when you're applying your CSS, what are the blocks? What are the like standalone components on the page that are sort of meaningful unto themselves? So we have the logo here, we have input, we have a menu which has these elements within it as the different blocks on this page. Then the elements themselves are parts of a block, so they don't have any meaning outside of that block. So like these menu elements, those really only have meaning when you think about them in the whole menu block. So for instance, we've got our stats block here, and then each of these things is an element within that stats block. So we have the stats container, which is an element inside of that block. We have the stat label, which is an element within that block, and the stat value, which is an element within that block. And the specific convention I'm using here is that this is the name of the block, and then when we have an element that's in the block, it starts with stats __, and then the name of that element that we have inside the block. There's a third part, so the modifier here is sometimes you have these states that your blocks or your elements can be in that are modified. Like here, they are illustrating that this input is a big input. So it has this modifier of size big, and this button is a themed button. It has this modifier of theme green. And so you kind of see this broken down in a syntax that looks something like this, where you have the block, and then you can have your 2 dashes and the modifier value. So here is a button that is in the sort of success modifier, and that CSS looks like this, where you start with the block name and then you attach this modifier to it, state success. Or we have the state danger one, which has different styling, it has red color, and a similar structure of 2 dashes. So we'll probably get into using modifiers when we get into the trivia. Just plant the seed that exists, and I'll make sure that this link is in the Canvas page so that you can always read more on BEM. there are other competing CSS methodologies here that you can check out. And also when we get into React, there's going to actually be some tooling that will help us cut down on this problem of CSS conflicts without having to create verbose names. But since you may be leaving this class and heading in and specializing in CSS, this methodology, this naming convention, you may encounter in the future, so it's worthwhile to learn, and it's a pretty simple set of rules to pick up. So let's start styling this. We want to do a couple of things. We want to make sure that these three elements show up on a line together, and then we may want to adjust some of the font sizing here and font styling. So let's pull these up side by side. And I'm going to go to my stats file. And let's start with styling the stats container itself. So one display property that we can set is called flex, which stands for flexbox, which is when we have a line of serial content that we want to display. Flex is the best way to do it. And it allows us to sort of have content that wraps horizontally. We can also have content that is laid out from top to bottom with flex, and it can also sort of snake around the page from top to bottom. And I'll make sure that this is in the Canvas page as well, but the CSS Tricks has a great overview of Flexbox that shows the properties that you apply to get content that is laying out horizontally from left to right, or right to left, or top to bottom, or bottom to top. And you can control how that content wraps, how that content is sized, how that content is spaced. And basically what I want to do here is leave a lot of the defaults, because we're already laying out something that goes from left to right. What I want to do is get this content centered over here. So I'm going to want to use justify content and center. And if I save this, now this is going to be laid out in the center of the page. And I want to remove some of the list styling that's being applied here. So the stats, if we look back at our index.html, this is the unordered list, this is the list. So on the unordered list, I'm going to remove the list style, set it to none. And then lists also by default have some margin. So if I select my unordered list here, they have some margin and they have some padding. So I'm just going to take over control of those. I'm going to get rid of the green padding that's on the left here, and I am going to control the margin on the top and bottom. So let's get rid of that padding, and let's have the margin be 0 on the top, 0 on the right. Let's make it 1 rem on the bottom and 1 on the left. So now we can start styling the container. So the container, if we look back at our index.html, is this list item. So let's go stats, stat container. And I want to make sure that all of these elements have a consistent size to them. I don't like how close these are to one another and how they're fairly small. So I'm going to say that there's a min width of 100 pixels for all of these. So now each of these containers is 100 pixels wide. And let's also center the text with text align center. And let's flip the color. So let's have the color be white and the background be some blue color that we will set here. Go pretty dark blue. We are going to add let's add some padding around the text. So top and bottom around the text here will be 0.4 rem and maybe like 0.6 rem on the left and right. Right, and let's add a border radius to kind of round the edges of these boxes. So border radius 0.5 rem. And then I also want to add some space in between these so they're not like right up against one another. So 0 margin for each of these containers on the top and 0.25 rem on the left and right. And maybe I'm going to tweak this color slightly and brighten it a little bit. Okay, that's not bad. So now we can style our label, so the score, the level, the question, and then the value. And I think I'm going to make this text a little bit smaller so that this text is emphasized. And maybe I'll make this italic. So here I'm going to create a styling rule for the stats label and stats value. And the label, let's try shrinking that to be like 0.7 or maybe 0.6 and make it italic. And then the stats value, let's see if we pump, oh, that's way too big. We'll just leave it at 1 rem. So there we go. We have our BEM methodology here where we're able to apply styles to the different elements that we're working with, and we've got a decent start for styling our stats container. So I'm going to add a comment up at the top. Flexbox is used to lay out elements in a series, and let's grab this article and drop it in here. There's a lot more that you can do with Flexbox. We're just scratching the surface. Just know that if you're trying to lay out a series of items within a container like we're doing here, Flexbox is one of the easiest options you have in modern CSS. So let's flip back to, if you hit Control P, it pulls up a Explorer that allows you to search for specific files. So if I want to pull up index.html, I just start typing index and it allows me to quickly switch. So what we want to do now is apply some class names to our trivia block so that we can start styling it and making it look pretty. So let's say that this is our trivia item. That's the name of our block. This will be our trivia item, and then the element, we will call this the question. We'll call this the trivia item answers. And let's have something similar here. This is going to be the trivia item answer singular, and then I'm going to copy and paste this. I'm hitting Control to insert multiple cursors, paste this in. So now I have all of my list items labeled as trivia answer, and then we're also going to want a class on our button to be able to assign some styles to these buttons. So I'm going to grab this and say that this is our trivia item button, and then copy and paste this and put it on all of our buttons. So it seems verbose at first, but we have now labeled all of our items in here that we're going to potentially want to apply some styling to. So we have the question, the answers, the individual answers, and the button. So let's start styling this. And if I hit Control P, I want to pull up the trivia item.css file that we created and start putting some rules in here. Start with the question. So trivia item question. I want this to be centered on the page. So text center, text align center. And let's make this a lot bigger so that it is easier to see. Font size, let's try 2 rem. It's pretty good. Let's also do the styling to make sure that these buttons show up in a grid. So we are targeting the answers element. So this is our unordered list. And we want to tell the browser that this should be laid out as a 2x2 grid. And Flexbox would be one way for us to do this, where we could say this is a series of items, lay them out as each being 50% of the width of the screen. So this button would take up 50%, the next one would take up 50%, and then the next two would show up on the next line. But there is actually, for setting the display, a grid styling, which allows us to say this should be a 2x2 grid that where each item is 50% of the row or 50% of the column. And this also has a complete guide from CSS Tricks. So grid CSS, I'll make sure that this is also linked. And grid is really helpful when you want to start laying out grids of elements. So Flexbox is for sort of a single stream within a container, and grid is for two-dimensionally laying out elements inside of a grid. So the grid template columns and grid template rows allows us to say how big are the rows and how big are the columns. So here this is saying we have 40 pixels for the first column, 50 pixels for the second, then it's auto, which will use up any of the available space, and then 50 pixels and 40 pixels. So there is a unit called FR, which allows us to just say divide up the space evenly. So we're actually going to use that. We're going to say grid template columns 1FR and 1FR, which says our columns should be 2 columns that are both the same size, and we're going to do the same thing for the rows. So we've got our basic grid, and let's start styling some of the button. So trivia item button elements by default are inline, and so we want to make sure that instead of being inline, they take up all of the space that's available to them. So block, which will allow them to get a width and a height. And if we specify width and height of 100%, that means that this button should be 100% of its parent. So the list item, so let's go back here. So we want this button to be as big as this list item. And then let's also add some padding, because these buttons are pretty skinny on the top and bottom. Let's add 2 rem, and we'll add 4 rem on the left and right. And let's get rid of some of this list styling. So the answers is our unordered list that, remember, has the list style and has some default margin and padding. So let's say that the list style is none, and the padding is 0, and the margin is 0. One more property on the grid that I think I want to set here is I want to add some space in between the rows and columns. And so there's a gap property that allows you to specify the gap for the rows and the gap for the columns. And if we just pass in one number, it will give us the gap for both the row and the column. So that's looking decent. So I think the last thing that we have to do on this page is just style these buttons, because the browser default is a bit boring. So we're going to change these buttons so that they're maybe blue buttons with white text. We will use our pseudo selectors to be able to style these buttons in their different states, because you can see as I'm hovering, these buttons are responding. They're having different styles. So in the hover pseudo class, we are going to be able to specify how this looks when it's hovered, and then when it's active, and then also if I hit my tab, how it's hovered or how it's styled when it's focused. So we want to use all of those properties to make sure that our buttons are nicely interactive and also accessible. So let's start with the basic styling for our button here. There is a cursor property, which has a bunch of different options for how the cursor should look when your mouse is over that element. I'm going to use cursor pointer to get an element that looks like it's clickable. I am going to remove the border and let's give it a background color of some kind of light blue and a color of white. Actually, I don't love this background color. Let's try this one. Well, that's basically the same. It's a little bit lighter. Let's add some font size here to pump up the text font size. Let's round these buttons slightly. So border radius. That looks good. And we're going to need to throw a transition on here. I'm going to leave that off for now. So we have our buttons, and we are now going to apply some of our pseudo selectors to be able to style these buttons in their different states. So for instance, I'm going to copy this and come down here and say, when we hover it, we should have a different background color. So we are going to grab this background color and we are going to darken it slightly. And let's also use the transform. So let's change the transform how we kind of did on the other page where we rotated it slightly and we scaled it slightly. And we're going to do a similar thing when we are in the active state. So if the button is currently being held down and pressed, and we want that to be even darker so that the user can see that they're actually clicking on it, and we'll have it rotate slightly more and scale slightly more. And I also, so the fact that these buttons are being outlined happens when the element is focused. So as I'm tabbing around the page, I am getting those elements being focused. And outline is a useful default property. So we usually don't want to take the outline away unless we are going to take control and make sure that the focus state is visible to the user. So I'm going to get rid of the outline, but make sure that I am now styling this element when we are in our focus state. And let's throw a border of 3 pixels solid black. So now our border is showing up around the button itself and not a rectangle with sort of the gaps that we had before. So let me flip back so that we can compare this. So our focus state, now that we're using border, looks a bit better because it follows the outline of the button. But it's doing something funky here where, because we're adding a border dynamically, you can see that the page is slightly resizing because these buttons are now becoming 3 pixels bigger when we focus on them. And so one way that we can get around this problem is making it so that our buttons always have a border. So I'm going to get rid of the border none here. And what we're going to do is say that the border is normally just transparent on these elements. So it's always there, it's transparent, and then when we are focused, instead of setting all of these, we can just say that the border color. changes from transparent to black. So this is looking decent. I think now we can add our transitions, and we know which properties we want to apply transitions to. We want to transition the background, and let's say it's 0.15 seconds, the transform, and the border color. Save that. So now we're getting a bit smoother of a user interface. So there are 3 more states that I want to style here before we can consider this done. And these are things that we'll be able to trigger from JavaScript. So I want to use the BEM idea of a modifier. So we're going to have when the buttons are disabled, so when the player has picked one of these, we're basically going to flip all of the buttons to disabled, and depending on what they clicked, we're either going to make this show up in green or red, depending on whether they got it correct or incorrect. So all of the buttons will be disabled, and then one of them will be either correct or incorrect. And the way that we indicate that this is in BEM style, that this is a modifier, is with 2 dashes. So for disabled, just for the sake of speeding this up, I'm just going to paste some colors in. So let's say that this is, when it's disabled, a light blue, this is a green, and this is a red. And so now we can try some of these states out to see how this looks. So I'm going to grab this disabled, and we're going to need more room to see all of this. So all of them I'm going to disable, and they will show up like this. And then I want to just take this first one, and let's say if they picked the correct answer, it should show up like this, where it's highlighted in green. And if they choose the incorrect answer, it will show up in red. Let's make one more tweak. So you can see that even though the background color is set to red here, when I hover over it, it is flipping from red to blue. We can fix that in our CSS. The reason why that's happening has to do with a concept that we haven't really talked about called specificity, where each selector that we create here, you can see in VS Code, is telling us the power, the specificity of that selector. And when we have multiple rules that are trying to target the background, the one with the higher specificity is going to win. If they have the same specificity, it'll be whichever rule was last. So if our hover and our correct, incorrect, disabled all had the same specificity, then these would get applied over the hover. But if we look at this, when we have a class selector and we have a pseudo class, it has a specificity of 0, 2, 0, and these have a specificity of 0, 1, 0. And so what we need to do here is just bump up the specificity of these elements. And one way to do that is to say that we're sort of looking for a more specific element. We want something that has a class of trivia item button and also has a class of trivia item button disabled. And now if I hover over this, the specificity is 0, 2, 0. Save it and check it out. Now these are no longer having their background color competing with the hover or active. Whatever color we have specified is sticking. So specificity is a big concept in CSS, and I don't want to get too bogged down into talking about it now, so I'll have some links in the Canvas page for checking it out so you can learn more about specificity. What I want to wrap up with is thinking about how this page that we have now, let me make these side by side again. Finished laying out and styling and filling in with some content, how do we make this ready for our JavaScript so that instead of this content showing up immediately, we actually can inject it dynamically so that then, this question shows up first, we choose our answer, our JavaScript can make sure that this question disappears. We can check whether they got it right or wrong, increment the score, and display a new question on the page. And the way that we are going to do that is with, let's flip back here. And actually, let's get rid of this incorrect and disabled styling. The way we're going to do this is with an element in HTML called a template element. So a template element in HTML. Whoops, this is not showing up in Emmet, so I'm just going to type it out. Template element is an element that doesn't actually show up on your page. So if I take our trivia item and drop it into a template element, it disappears, but it is still loaded in the browser's memory. So we will still be able from JavaScript to get access to this template. And then what we're going to do is clone it and fill in the content and then put it on the page. So template you can think of as sort of like the blueprint for our HTML that we're going to inject into the page. And this just gives us an easy way to lay it out so that our JavaScript has access to it. So we're going to need an ID on this template so that we can grab it from our JavaScript ID, and we'll call this the trivia item template. And then we're also going to want an ID on this score value, level, and question so that we can reach in and grab those as well. So I'm going to say we've got an ID of score, an ID of level, ID of question number. And now what we can do, I'm going to bring back the sidebar with Control B. We're going to create a JavaScript file. Let's call this index.js to match the fact that this is index.html. We are going to link it in with script source JS index.js. And what I want to do is this content that we have in here, we are going to remove from our template so that there isn't this base default question about Back to the Future in here. So deleting all this. And I want to fill this in dynamically with some JavaScript. So what we're going to do is grab that question here. This format should look familiar. This is basically an object literal. In the world of APIs and data storage, this is called JSON for JavaScript object notation, but it's valid JavaScript. So I can just copy this, flip back to index.js, and create a variable called trivia data and set it equal to this JavaScript object. You can see my formatter is removing some of the unnecessary double quotation marks, but I was able to just grab that directly from the API. So you can grab your own question from the API as long as it's one of the ones that has multiple choice, or you can just pause the video and copy this down. But we're working with sample data from that API so that then when we actually go to just reach out to that API directly to pull some data in dynamically when the application starts, our application should work fine with it. So we're going to need to grab our trivia template, trivia item template, and that was the element that we created, the the template element that had a selector of trivia item template. When we get this element, it's going to give us this content. We are able to clone it and put it on the page, and we're going to want to insert it here. So actually we should create a container where we're going to insert all of our trivia items. So I'm going to create a container here, give this an ID of trivia container. Whoops, misspelled that. So we're gonna grab this content. In terms of the JavaScript, how this is gonna look, it's as if we copied this, pasted it in here, and filled in the question and answers. So let's also make sure we get that trivia container. Trivia container. So to create a new element from our template here, it's going to look like this. Trivia item template dot content dot clone node. For those of you coming from an object-oriented background, I will highlight this. So the template that we have gotten access to is an instance of this class, HTML template element, which inherits from HTML element, and node, and event target. The property that we're reading here is content, which is basically a document fragment. It's a piece of the document object model, the DOM, that we can then manipulate and insert into our page. So we are getting the content, that fragment, and we are cloning it, and then we're able to talk to our trivia container and say, append child, here you go, here's the new trivia, throw it on the page. And if we check out our page, we should hopefully, oh, well, no, we open up our console, looks like we've got an error. It's always important to, when you're working in JavaScript, make sure that you haven't made a typo somewhere. So I'm getting an error on line 13. And it's telling me that I tried to access this content property of a variable that does not exist. So that sounds like this trivia item template, I wasn't able to actually find it in my HTML. So I may have made a typo here, so I'm going to double check. So trivia item template, and I started with the hash. Check my HTML here, trivia item template. So there's no typo there, which means that, you know what's probably happening. This script tag, if I don't put in type equals module here, by default, that means that as soon as the HTML is parsed, as the browser is reading the head, it's going to stop and it's going to run this JavaScript, which means it's basically running the JavaScript before anything gets put on the page, before our template even exists. So the mistake I made is forgetting to put type equals module here on our script, which among enabling the import and export syntax that we'll see in the next video, this also tells the browser, don't run this script until all of the HTML has finished loading on the page. So if I save this and check it out in the browser, there we go. So we have our dummy HTML. If I go back to the elements and I sort of inspect them, we can see we've got all of our classes. It's just that nothing has been filled in. So we can now work on the JavaScript to fill that content in. So I'm going to need to get the question and our buttons. So I want to be able to get this question. So I can use query selector on the document to search through the document, or I can use it on HTML elements, which new trivia is, to look within specifically new trivia for a question. So I can say my question element is equal to this, and then question element dot. Normally we would be able to say text content equals, and then we would set it equal to this. But since some of these things will have actual HTML escape entities in it, we actually need to say inner HTML to say that what we're inserting in here could be HTML. So I'm going to say the question element, its HTML should be equal to this text here. But instead of just copy and pasting, what I want to do is reach into this trivia data and say, give me the question property. So if I save this and check it out, we can see who is the main protagonist showing up. And I want to get the button elements. So here, I want to get all 4 of these so that I can fill in each one at a time. So I'm going to grab this selector, and we're going to see that there is a query selector all, which allows us to ask for multiple elements on the page. So I'm saying give me all of the elements that have this class name in a collection called an array. And we're going to talk about arrays in the next video. So for this, just bear with me. This is a series of buttons, and I can access individual ones from it. So if I say button elements, open close brackets, and put in the number 0, that's giving me the first button. So I can then say inner HTML equals, let's put that as the correct answer here. So trivia data.correct answer, save it. We can see the first one is being inserted here into this first button. And now what I'm going to do is grab the second button's inner HTML and set it equal to this text here. So this is also an array. So if I want to grab the first thing here, I'm going to say incorrect answers, and then I'm going to use the brackets to say 0. So incorrect answers 0. So we are grabbing the first incorrect answer and putting it into the second button. Emmett.Brown. And let's just repeat this for incorrect answer 1 and 2 and 3, and we're gonna have to do the third button and the fourth button. Whoops, fourth button. There we go. We got a item loading on the page. This syntax, don't worry, we're gonna talk about arrays and diagram this out, and this will make sense in the next video. But for now, just trust me that this is the right syntax that we want here. And the advantage of doing this in JavaScript is now if I flip back and let's grab the next question here, let's grab this one and paste it in here. Save it. Now we have our Gremlins question loading. So because we're working from JavaScript, we're able to take that template and fill it in with whatever we want. And we're going to be able to use that idea to create the game where after I choose one of these, mark it correct or wrong, and load the next one on the page. So I will see you in the next video where we will start digging into the JavaScript that we need to be able to orchestrate this into the game.